Some people do not fail because they never start. They fail because they start too many times and finish none. At 1:13 in the morning, Ethan Brooks stood alone in the middle of his small apartment in Ohio, staring at the quiet mess around him. The room was not dirty in a normal way. It was worse than that. It was full of unfinished promises. In one corner, there was a guitar he had bought 6 months ago because he said he was going to learn music and play at open mic nights. The strings were still bright, but a thin layer of dust covered the wooden body. Near the window, a half-painted canvas leaned against the wall. It showed the beginning of a sunset, but the sky stopped halfway, as if even the colors had given up waiting for him. Beside his couch sat a pair of running shoes, clean and almost new, the kind people buy when they imagine a better version of themselves waking up at 6 a.m. and running 3 miles before breakfast. On his desk were notebooks filled with first pages. The first page of a business idea, the first page of a novel, the first page of a workout plan, the first page of a budget. But almost nothing had a second page. Ethan looked at all of it and felt a heavy silence inside his chest. He was only 25, but somehow his room already looked like a museum of abandoned dreams. Every object seemed to whisper the same thing to him. You were excited once. What happened? Ethan sat down at his desk and picked up a broken old clock he had found at a yard sale for $5. He had bought it because he wanted to learn how to fix things and maybe sell restored clocks online. For 2 days, he had felt excited. He watched videos, ordered small tools, and told his younger sister Lily that this time would be different. But then the clock became harder to understand. The tiny screws were annoying. The gears were confusing. The excitement faded. And just like always, Ethan wanted to move on to something new. He turned the clock over in his hands and sighed. I will finish it later, he whispered. But the words sounded weak, because he had heard them too many times before. Later was where his dreams went to disappear. Outside, the street was quiet. A soft rain tapped against the window. Ethan stood up, ready to put the clock back in the box with all the other things he never finished. But as he reached for the box, he noticed something strange. The clock's hands were frozen at exactly 7 o'clock. Not 7:01. Not 6:59. Exactly 7 o'clock. For some reason, that small detail bothered him. It felt like the clock had not stopped randomly. It felt like it was waiting. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, and for the first time that night, he wondered if the clock was not the only thing in that room that had stopped moving. The next morning, Ethan woke up later than he had planned, as he often did. The rain had stopped, but the sky outside his window was still gray, and the whole apartment felt quiet in a way that made every unfinished thing seem louder. The broken clock was still on his desk, its hands frozen at exactly 7 o'clock, facing him like a question he did not want to answer. Ethan looked away and reached for his phone. For a few minutes, he scrolled through videos of people changing their lives, building businesses, getting in shape, learning new skills, and becoming the kind of person he always imagined he could be. Every video gave him a small spark. Every story made him think, maybe this is what I should do next. But deep down, Ethan knew this feeling very well. It was the warm beginning. It was the easy part. He loved the first day of anything. The first day made him feel strong. The first day made him feel like a new man. On the first day, he could buy the tools, make the plan, clean the desk, write the goal, and tell someone that everything was about to change. But then came the second week. Then came the quiet morning when nobody praised him. Then came the small mistake that made him feel foolish. Then came the slow progress that did not look like progress at all. That was where Ethan always disappeared. When his mother called that morning, she asked him how the clock project was going. Ethan forced a light laugh and said, "It is going pretty well. I just need a little more time." His mother was silent for a moment. Not because she was angry, but because she had heard that sentence many times before. Then she said gently, "Ethan, you always have good ideas. I just hope one of them finally becomes real." Those words stayed with him after the call ended. They were not cruel words, but somehow they hurt more because they were true. Later that afternoon, his younger sister Lily stopped by after school. She was 16, quiet, and always carried a sketchbook under her arm. She looked around Ethan's room and smiled softly, not making fun of him, just noticing. She picked up the guitar and brushed the dust with her fingers. Then she looked at the half-painted canvas near the window. After a while, she said, "You still have so many cool things in here." Ethan shrugged and said the same thing he always said. "I just have not found the right thing yet." Lily nodded, but her eyes moved to the broken clock on the desk. Maybe, she said, or maybe you leave too early to find out what the right thing can become. Ethan wanted to answer quickly, but he could not. He looked at the clock again. The hands had not moved, but something inside him had. For the first time, he wondered whether his problem was not choosing the wrong dreams. Maybe his problem was walking away before any dream had a chance to become difficult enough to matter. That evening, Ethan tried to forget Lily's words by making a new plan, because planning always felt easier than doing. He opened a fresh notebook, wrote the word tomorrow at the top of the page, and underlined it twice. He promised himself he would wake up early, clean the apartment, fix the clock, finish the painting, go for a run, and maybe even apply for a better job. For a few minutes, he felt proud, as if writing the plan had already changed his life. But the next morning, the plan stayed on the desk while Ethan rushed to his part-time job at a small shipping store downtown. He was supposed to arrive by 8 o'clock, but he walked in at 8:27, breathing fast, holding a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. His manager, Mrs. Parker, looked at him with tired eyes. She was not a harsh woman. She had given Ethan more chances than most people would. She had watched him start tasks with energy, then leave boxes half-labeled, shelves half-organized, and customer orders waiting because he got distracted by a new idea. That morning, a stack of packages sat on the counter, each one needing a label before noon. Mrs. Parker pointed to them and said, "Ethan, I need you to finish this before you do anything else." Ethan nodded quickly. "Of course, I will get it done." For the first 20 minutes, he worked well. Then one label printed wrong. Then a customer asked him a question. Then his phone buzzed with a video about starting a home business. Ethan told himself he would watch only 1 minute, just to learn something useful. But 1 minute became 10. When Mrs. Parker came back, only 6 packages were finished, and the rest were still sitting there. She did not raise her voice. She simply took off her glasses and said, "Ethan, I think today needs to be your last day here." Ethan stared at her, surprised even though part of him knew this moment had been coming. He tried to explain, but the words felt small. Mrs. Parker said gently, "You are smart, Ethan. You are kind to customers. You have good ideas. But people need to trust that when you say something will be done, it will be done." Ethan walked home slowly with his final paycheck in his pocket. It was not much, only enough for rent and a few groceries. The sky had cleared, but he felt heavier with every step. When he reached his apartment, Lily was sitting on the front steps, hugging her sketchbook to her chest. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile faded when she noticed his face. "Ethan, what happened?" she asked. He tried to say nothing, but Lily knew him too well. After a long silence, he told her about the job. Lily looked down at her sketchbook and whispered that she had been accepted into a weekend art program in Columbus. It cost $300, and the payment was due in 7 days. She said it softly, as if she did not want to add weight to his heart. Ethan looked at her drawings, then at his own empty hands. For once, quitting did not feel like a private problem. It had reached someone he loved. He went upstairs, took the broken clock from his desk, and placed it in front of him. 7 days, he whispered. "This time, I have to finish." That night, Ethan stayed at his desk until almost 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by tiny screwdrivers, online tutorials, and the quiet ticking of a cheap kitchen clock on the wall. The old clock in front of him still did not move. He opened the back, stared at the small gears, and tried to understand how everything fit together. At first, he felt hopeful. He cleaned the dust. He removed one loose screw. He watched a video about clock repair and told himself that maybe this would not be too hard. But after an hour, the small pieces began to look the same. The words in the video felt confusing. Every time he touched one part, another part shifted. Ethan felt that familiar heat of frustration rise in his chest. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "This is too much," he whispered. "Maybe I should find another way to make the money." But when he looked across the room, he saw Lily's sketchbook on the table. She had forgotten it on the front steps earlier. A pencil drawing was sticking out from between the pages. It showed a girl standing in front of a large art studio, holding a paintbrush like it was a key to a new life. Ethan looked at that drawing for a long time. Then he picked up the clock again. The next morning, he carried it downstairs and walked across the quiet street to a small blue house with white trim and a neat front porch. An old man named Henry Collins lived there. Everyone in the neighborhood called him Mr. Collins. He had silver hair, calm eyes, and hands that moved slowly, as if they had learned patience over many years. People said he used to repair watches and clocks for shops all over Ohio before he retired. Ethan had seen him many times sitting on his porch, polishing old clock parts or feeding birds, but he had never spoken to him for more than a few polite words. When Mr. Collins opened the door, Ethan held up the clock and said, "Sir, I am sorry to bother you, but I need to fix this. I only have 7 days, and I do not know what I am doing." Mr. Collins looked at the clock, then looked at Ethan's tired face. He did not laugh. He did not hurry. He simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." His small workshop smelled like wood, oil, and old paper. Shelves covered the walls, filled with clocks of every size. Some were tall and elegant. Some were small enough to fit in one hand. Some were open, showing their tiny golden wheels inside. Ethan placed his clock on the workbench and quickly explained everything: the lost job, Lily's art program, the 7-day deadline, and how badly he needed to finish something for once. Mr. Collins listened without interrupting. Then he picked up the clock and studied it under a lamp. After a while, he asked, "Do you want to fix this clock, Ethan, or do you only want to feel excited about fixing it for one more day?" Ethan blinked, unsure how to answer. Mr. Collins turned the clock gently in his hands and said, "Many people love the beginning because the beginning makes them feel brave. But the middle is quiet. The middle is slow. The middle asks who you are when nobody is watching." Ethan looked down at the workbench. Mr. Collins placed the clock between them and said, "I can show you how to repair it, but first you must understand something. This clock is not your real problem. The real problem is that every time life becomes boring, you call it a sign to quit." Ethan felt those words settle inside him. For once, he did not defend himself. He only nodded. Mr. Collins pulled out a wooden chair and pointed to it. Then he said, "Sit here for 30 minutes. Do not touch the tools. Do not check your phone. Do not make a plan. Just look at the clock and learn to stay." Ethan sat in the wooden chair and looked at the old clock on the workbench. At first, 30 minutes sounded simple. He thought it would be nothing compared to fixing the whole clock, finding $300, and helping Lily before the payment was due. But after only 2 minutes, his hands wanted to move. He wanted to pick up a screwdriver. He wanted to open the back of the clock again. He wanted to ask Mr. Collins what to do next. Most of all, he wanted to reach for his phone and escape into something easy. Mr. Collins noticed, but he said nothing. He simply sat across from Ethan, cleaning a small gear with a soft cloth. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of other clocks on the shelves. Tick, tick, tick. Every sound seemed to remind Ethan that time was passing, and he was just sitting there. After 5 minutes, Ethan shifted in his seat. After 8 minutes, he tapped his foot on the floor. After 10 minutes, he looked toward the window and watched a delivery truck roll slowly down the street. His mind started searching for a way out. Maybe this was a waste of time. Maybe Mr. Collins was only testing his patience. Maybe he should go home and try something faster. But then he remembered his mother's words, Lily's sketchbook, and Mrs. Parker's tired face when she told him that people needed to trust his word. Ethan swallowed and looked back at the clock. The hands were still frozen at exactly 7 o'clock. He studied the glass, the small scratches on the frame, and the tiny dust caught near the edge of the face. Then his eyes moved to the open back. Inside, the gears were not as random as they had seemed the night before. One small wheel touched another. One thin spring connected to a hidden piece near the center. A narrow metal arm rested against a gear that looked slightly crooked. Ethan leaned closer, not touching anything. For the first time, he was not rushing to fix it. He was only trying to understand it. At 15 minutes, something strange happened. The boredom did not disappear, but it became quieter. His breathing slowed. His thoughts stopped jumping so quickly. He noticed that the clock was not one big problem. It was 100 small parts, each with a place, each with a reason. Mr. Collins looked up and asked, "What do you see?" Ethan answered slowly, "I see that I always look at the whole problem, and then I get scared." Mr. Collins nodded. "That is why you leave. You turn one step into a mountain before you even take it." Ethan looked at the clock again. He thought about the guitar, the painting, the running shoes, the notebooks, and every dream he had made too large in his own mind. He had never quit on the first day, because the first day was full of pictures in his head. He had quit when the picture became work. He had quit when success stopped feeling exciting and started asking for patience. 25 minutes passed. Ethan no longer wanted to run away from the chair. He watched the crooked gear and felt a small question forming inside him. What if finishing was not about feeling ready? What if it was only about staying long enough to see the next small step? When the 30 minutes ended, Mr. Collins placed the cloth on the table and gently turned the clock toward Ethan. Now, he said, you may touch one thing. Not 10 things. Not the whole clock. Just one thing. Ethan pointed to the small crooked gear near the center. I think this one is stuck, he said. Mr. Collins smiled for the first time that morning. Good. You did not find that by rushing. You found it by staying. Ethan picked up the tiny screwdriver with careful hands. The tool felt lighter now, but the moment felt heavier. He was not just repairing a clock. He was learning to remain in the part of the journey where he had always disappeared. Ethan placed the tip of the tiny screwdriver against the small crooked gear and tried to loosen the screw beside it. His hand was not steady. The screw was so small that it looked almost impossible to control, and every time he turned the tool, he felt afraid he would damage something. Mr. Collins stood beside him, but he did not take over. He only said, slow hands make fewer mistakes. Ethan breathed in, then tried again. This time the screw moved just a little. It was not much, but it was movement. For a moment, Ethan felt proud. Then the screwdriver slipped, and the tiny gear jumped out of place. It rolled across the wooden workbench, fell onto the floor, and disappeared under a cabinet. Ethan froze. His face became warm with frustration. He pushed the chair back and stood up quickly. I knew this would happen, he said. I am not good at this. Mr. Collins did not look surprised. He bent down slowly, picked up a small flashlight, and handed it to Ethan. Then find it. Ethan stared at him. That is all. Mr. Collins nodded. That is all. Ethan wanted a bigger answer. He wanted comfort. He wanted Mr. Collins to say that the clock was too hard or that anyone would have made the same mistake. Instead, the old man simply waited. Ethan got down on one knee and shined the flashlight under the cabinet. Dust covered the floor. A few old screws rested near the wall. Then he saw the gear, caught beside a wooden leg, no bigger than a dime. He reached carefully and pulled it out. When he placed it back on the workbench, he expected Mr. Collins to fix the mistake for him. But Mr. Collins only pointed to the clock and said, put it back. Ethan shook his head. What if I mess it up again? Then you adjust again, Mr. Collins said. People who never finish think a mistake means the story is over. People who finish understand that a mistake is just information. Ethan looked at the tiny gear in his palm. He thought about how many times one small mistake had made him walk away. One sore morning had ended his running plan. One bad chapter had ended his novel. One awkward chord had ended his guitar practice. One confusing step had ended almost everything. He had called those moments signs that he was not meant for something. But maybe they were only normal parts of learning. Ethan sat down again. This time, he did not rush. He placed the gear where it belonged, checked the small teeth, and turned the screw gently. It slipped once, but he corrected it. It shifted again, but he stayed. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the gear finally rested in place. Ethan leaned back and let out a quiet breath. Nothing amazing happened. The clock did not start ticking. No bright feeling filled the room. But something inside Ethan felt different. He had made a mistake, and he had not run from it. Mr. Collins nodded toward the clock and said, good. Now you have done something more important than fixing a gear. You have returned to the work after it disappointed you. Ethan looked at the frozen hands still pointing at exactly 7 o'clock. For the first time, they did not look like a failure. They looked like a challenge waiting for one more small step. Over the next few days, Ethan returned to Mr. Collins's workshop every morning and worked at his own apartment every night. The first day, he learned how to clean the inside of the clock without bending the tiny parts. The second day, he learned how to place the gears back in the right order. The third day, he learned that even one screw turned too tightly could stop the whole thing from moving. Each lesson was small, but each lesson asked him to stay longer than he wanted to stay. Sometimes his back hurt from leaning over the desk. Sometimes his eyes felt tired from looking at parts smaller than a grain of rice. Sometimes the work became so quiet that his mind begged for something exciting. But whenever he wanted to stop, he remembered Mr. Collins's words. The middle asks who you are when nobody is watching. By Friday evening, the clock was almost finished. The town fair would open the next morning, and Ethan had cleaned the wooden frame until it shined softly under the desk lamp. He had polished the glass, fixed the loose gear, and carefully placed the hands back on the face. For the first time in years, something he had started was close to becoming real. Lily sat on the floor nearby, drawing quietly in her sketchbook while Ethan made the final adjustment. His mother had called earlier to say she was proud of him for trying, and even those simple words gave him strength. Ethan turned the small key in the back of the clock. Then he waited. For one beautiful second, the clock began to tick. Tick, tick, tick. Ethan smiled. Lily looked up and whispered, "You did it." But before Ethan could answer, the ticking slowed. The sound became uneven. Then it stopped completely. The hands froze again. Only this time they stopped at 10:46. The room became silent. Ethan stared at the clock as if it had betrayed him. He turned the key again. Nothing happened. He checked the back. Nothing looked clearly broken. He tried to move one small part, then another, but the clock stayed still. The old feeling rushed back into him. Shame, anger, tiredness. The heavy thought that maybe this was simply who he was. Maybe he was the kind of person who came close but never crossed the finish line. Lily stood up slowly and said, "Ethan, maybe Mr. Collins can help in the morning." But Ethan shook his head. "The fair starts at 8. It is too late." He placed the clock in a cardboard box and pushed it toward the wall. Then he sat on the edge of the couch and covered his face with both hands. Lily did not argue. She only picked up her sketchbook and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she tore out one page and placed it on his desk. After she was gone, Ethan looked at the drawing. It showed him sitting at a workbench, surrounded by broken parts, but in the drawing his hands were still on the clock. Under the picture, Lily had written, "My brother is learning how to come back." Ethan read those words once. Then again. The apartment was quiet, and the clock was still silent in the box. But Ethan stood up, wiped his eyes, and pulled the box back onto the desk. This time, he did not return because he felt excited. He returned because the promise mattered more than the feeling. Ethan worked through the night with Lily's drawing beside the clock. He did not move quickly. He did not try to force the answer. He only did what Mr. Collins had taught him to do. Stay, look, adjust. He opened the back of the clock again and placed each tiny part under the desk lamp. At first, everything seemed right. The gears were clean. The spring was in place. The hands were straight. Nothing looked broken. That made Ethan feel even more frustrated, because it is hard to fix a problem you cannot see. For a moment, the old thought returned. Just stop. You already tried. No one can blame you now. But then Ethan looked at Lily's words again. "My brother is learning how to come back." He took a slow breath and turned the key gently. He watched the first gear move, then the second, then the third. Suddenly, the third gear stopped. It did not look damaged. It was not missing a tooth. It was not out of place. It was simply too tight. Ethan stared at it, surprised by how small the problem was. All this time, he had thought the clock had failed again, but it only needed a little space to move. He loosened the screw by the smallest turn, almost less than a quarter inch. Then he turned the key again. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. This time, the sound did not stop. Ethan leaned back in his chair and felt his eyes fill with quiet relief. He did not jump. He did not shout. He only sat there, listening to the steady sound of something he had almost abandoned. When the sun rose, Ethan cleaned the frame one last time and carried the clock to the town fair. His hands were tired, and his shirt was wrinkled, but he walked with the clock held carefully against his chest. At the fair, tables were filled with handmade candles, wooden signs, baked pies, and old tools polished until they looked new again. Ethan placed the clock on a small table near the end of the row. It was not the most beautiful item there. A few scratches still showed on the wood. The glass had a faint mark near the edge. But the clock was ticking. Around noon, a woman who owned a small antique shop stopped in front of it. She listened to the sound and asked, "Did you restore this yourself?" Ethan hesitated, then told her the truth. He told her how he almost quit, how it stopped the night before, and how the problem was only a screw turned too tightly. The woman smiled and said, "That is why I like it. Perfect things do not always have the best stories." She paid $300 for the clock and asked if he could repair more. Ethan looked across the fair and saw Lily standing with their mother, holding her sketchbook close to her heart. For the first time, Ethan understood that finishing did not mean everything had to be flawless. Finishing meant returning when the work became boring, staying when mistakes appeared, and giving the dream enough time to breathe. Later that afternoon, Mr. Collins walked by the table and heard about the sale. He placed one gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "Now you understand. A clock does not run because every part is perfect. It runs because every part keeps working with the others. People are not so different." When Ethan handed the $300 to Lily, she did not say much at first. She only looked at the money, then at her brother, as if she was seeing him in a new way. Their mother smiled with tears in her eyes, not because the money had solved every problem, but because Ethan had kept his word. That evening, after the fair ended, Ethan walked back to his apartment with tired feet and a quiet heart. Nothing magical had happened. His bills were still there. His room was still full of unfinished things. The guitar still leaned in the corner. The painting still waited by the window. The running shoes were still clean. But Ethan was not the same person who had stood in that room a week earlier. He understood something now. The reason people do not finish what they start is not always laziness. It is not always lack of talent. Many times, they quit because they believe the excitement at the beginning is supposed to carry them all the way to the end. But excitement is only a spark. It can help you begin, but it cannot build the whole fire. The middle of every dream is usually quiet. It is slow. It is repetitive. It does not always give you praise. It does not always feel special. That is why so many people leave there. They think boredom means they chose the wrong path. They think a mistake means they are not good enough. They think slow progress means nothing is happening. But the clock taught Ethan a different lesson. Sometimes the problem is not that everything is broken. Sometimes one small part is stuck. Sometimes one screw is too tight. Sometimes all you need is to stay long enough to notice the next small adjustment. The people who finish are not always the smartest people in the room. They are not always the most talented. They are not always the ones who feel motivated every morning. They are the ones who return to the work after the feeling fades. They return after the mistake. They return after the boring day. They return when nobody is watching. A few days later, Ethan cleaned his apartment, not all at once, but one corner at a time. He tuned the guitar and learned one simple song. He put on his running shoes and walked 1 mile, not 3. He opened one notebook and finished the second page. Each small action felt ordinary, but Ethan no longer hated ordinary things. He had learned that ordinary steps are how unfinished dreams become real. One evening, Mr. Collins stopped by and found Ethan repairing another old clock at his desk. The room was still imperfect, but it was no longer a museum of abandoned dreams. It was becoming a workshop. Mr. Collins listened to the gentle ticking and smiled. Ethan looked at the clock, then at the unfinished painting by the window, and said softly, "I used to think finishing meant never stopping. Now I know it means coming back one more time then I leave."